ויחי יעקב בארץ מצרים 17 שנה, ויהי ימי יעקב שני חייו 7 שנים ו40 שנה, ויקרבו ימי ישראל למוס, ויקרא לבנו ליוסף, ויאמר לו אם נא מצאתי חן בעיניך, שים נא ידך תחת סירכי, ועשיסה עמדי חסד ואמת, אל נא תקברני במצרים.
This week's Torah portion is called Vayechi. This is the last passage from the book of Genesis. And it starts with Genesis chapter 48, verse 28, where it says, Jacob lived in a land of Egypt 17 years. This is why Vayechi, now it's the time of Jacob and of his life. There are similarities with what happens at the end of Jacob's life, similar to his father's Isaac. At the end of his life, his eyesight also becomes weak, and at the end of his life, he is calling Joseph with his 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And why does he do that? For only one reason. He wants to bless not Joseph, but to bless Ephraim and Manasseh, his grandchildren, which is very unusual. In fact, Jacob is adopting his own grandchildren in such a way that they would have equal standing in the inheritance with the children. This happens usually only in one case, in the case of Yavum, when Yavam is helping the widow of his brother to have the children. They become the grandchildren of the father, but the father adopts them so that they would receive the inheritance which belonged to their deceased father. But Joseph is alive. But in the eyes of Jacob, he was dead for so long that Jacob seems to act out of his emotions, trying to adopt his children in such a way, adopt Joseph's children in such a way that Joseph would receive the double portion of the inheritance, in a way sort of compensating for the lost years. This is why Jacob is doing what he is doing. And in fact, at the end of the life of every patriarch, we see in some ways their human weakness. Similar, the weakness was displayed at the end of the life of Abraham, and the weakness in some way is displayed at the end of the life of Jacob. We're all human, but God doesn't judge us for our weaknesses. He judges us based on our relations. But our weaknesses, our problems definitely have an impact of what we do in our life. And that's why the blessing of Ephraim and Manasseh is very particular on that. First problem we already showed, but the second problem follows. Jacob is weak in his eyesight, so he supposedly doesn't see properly. But Nevertheless, when Joseph brings Ephraim, his youngest, and Manasseh, his firstborn, he places them in order of birth. Ephraim youngest, to the left hand, Manasseh is the oldest, to the right hand. But Joseph does like this. And his right hand ends up upon the hand of Ephraim. This is why Ephraim, in the prophetic literature especially, becomes a symbol of Israel. This is why often when prophets refer to the northern kingdom of Israel, they always talk either about Joseph or about Israel or about Ephraim. Because in fact, Joseph was transformed from one into two largest tribes among the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom. And out of Ephraim, there were kings of the northern kingdom. Joseph is trying to place his son in order, but Jacob is doing the opposite. We know the reason for it. The problem of Jacob being the second really hurts him until the end of his days. Yeah, this is true that in ancient Middle East, the firstborn receives the privilege. The oldest son among the two receives 2/3 of inheritance, while the youngest receives the third. Well, he and Esau were twins. Their difference was maybe within a minute or so, but nevertheless, the practice existed no matter what. And Jacob, all his life, felt himself cheated. Regardless of the prophecy which God gave to Rivka in Genesis 25, when he clearly said, 2 nations are fighting inside your womb, and the youngest will rule over the oldest. Regardless of that, Jacob always felt unfit, always felt bitter. And that's why he is really set out at the end of his life, set out to destroy the institution of the birthright. In some ways, that tradition doesn't really work, especially in the spiritual matters. While it could be easier, definitely, for the father to just always assign the biggest portion of inheritance to his oldest child, but in the spiritual matters, the oldest doesn't really fit, doesn't really happen to be the most mature. And it was clearly demonstrated when Esau really didn't care about God and relations with him. We don't exactly know whether Jacob knew the heart of Ephraim. What we do know in the future, that Ephraim has become the leader of the northern tribes. And unfortunately, that tribe has led Israel way astray and ended up in the Assyrian captivity and finally disappeared, assimilating with the other pagan nations, which actually is an indicator that neither oldest nor youngest necessarily mean that these people will make the right choices. But in the family of Jacob, that is exactly what happened. In Genesis 49, Jacob gathers all his sons and gives them prophetic characteristics. It's hard to call all of the characteristics of each son of Jacob the prophetic ones, but nevertheless, some of them are. And some of the people of different tribes, some of the tribes really fulfilled the prediction of Jacob. In verse 3 of Genesis 49, Jacob talks about Reuben. You are my firstborn, my might and my beginning of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. Uncontrolled as water, you shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed. Then you defiled it. He went up to my couch. That's true. What we have here is another example of immaturity of the firstborn. When Reuben has slept with one of the servants of Jacob's wives, who actually were his wife when he slept with Bilhah, Jacob basically punishes his son for this by depriving him from the part of being the firstborn right away. Well, if Reuben is out of the picture, will Shimon, his second son, be the firstborn? The answer is no. Verse 5, Shimon and Levi, Simeon and Levi are brothers. Their sword are implements of violence. Let my soul not enter into their council. Let not my glory be united with their assembly, because in their anger they slew men, and in their self-will they lamed oxen. Cursed be the anger for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will disperse them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. Jacob refers to a cruel act of slaughtering the residents of Shechem. Jacob clearly blames here Levi and Simeon for basically setting off the plan of God and destroying the perspective for the peaceful acquisition of the land. What we talked about in the previous weekly Torah portion, Jacob confirms here in these verses. With regards to the curse, that can be looked upon from a different perspective. Yeah, this is true. The tribe of Simeon wasn't the largest tribe in Israel, and it was actually settled on some kind of a land which wasn't really the best, and economically it wasn't prosperous. That is true, but with regards to the scattering of the Levites, to call it a curse is actually not necessarily true. In fact, the tribe of Levi was the only tribe which did not participate in the building of the golden calf. This is why God gave to the tribe of Levi specific assignment to be the priests for entire nation. The tribe of Levi was a unique tribe because they were supposed to be fed by the other tribes. The entire 10th part of the gross national product of Israel was actually feeding that tribe. I don't know if it was called if this can be called a curse. Well, the one who remains is Judah. Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be one on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons shall bow down to you. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He couches, he lies down as a lion who dares rouse him up. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff between his feet, until the Shiloh comes, and to him shall be obedience of the people. All commentators, including Rashi and the sages, understand the meaning of the word Shiloh as a Messiah. It is clear from the text here that Jacob, in fact, chooses Judah as the firstborn, because, in fact, he speaks about the Judah and the representative of the tribe of Judah to be a ruler of Israel. This is definitely a prophecy, and basically this is one of the two prophecies, messianic prophecies, in the book of Genesis. The first one is in the very beginning, in Genesis 3:16, when it talks about the seed of the woman as the one who crushes the skull of the serpent. That is a messianic prophecy. And here, the tribe of Judah, which is to carry out the rule over Israel until the Messiah comes. It is interesting that it says here, and to him shall be obedience of the peoples. Today, a group which is well known, Lubavitch Hasidic group, strongly believes, based on this text, that the Messiah shall not come until the entire Israel becomes obedient to the Torah. And this is why they're so much motivated to go around the world with their mitzvah mobile, trying to bring the Jewish people into obedience to the Torah teaching them to keep the commandments, and particularly they believe that the Messiah will come only when the entire Israel will be able to keep the Sabbath for one time, at least one time. The other sons of Jacob are represented here, and different characteristics are given to them. Some of them prophetic, some of them are just the characteristics, very hard to verify, because Jacob here is talking in a very old poetic language, and some of the imagery is not quite understood to its details, but in fact every son is likened to some kind of an animal, which eventually this comparison, this metaphoric language has turned into the symbolism, and the lion is a symbol of Judah, and the other animals become the symbol of different other tribes. But the main prophecy in this chapter is the prophecy of Judah, where Jacob makes him the firstborn. Jacob also talks about Joseph. He doesn't talk about Ephraim and Manasseh. And he calls Joseph as a fruitful bough. Yeah, this is true. That's also, we talked about this, that the tribes which originated from Joseph, 2 tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh, even though it's a little bit awkward, because if you take the tribe of Israel and Manasseh, you will see that these 2 tribes make the number of the tribes of Israel into 13. Nevertheless, the tribes are considered to be 12, just because number 12 is a number of covenant, and it's symbolic. The truth, Joseph, the 2 tribes, are the most numerous of the tribes of Israel, and it says here that from there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. Well, here is definitely prophetically this was fulfilled, but was fulfilled in the negative sense, because both of these tribes, particularly Ephraim's tribe, have actually led Israel into idolatry, and that's why the characteristics which Jacob gives here sometimes a little bit dubious here with regards to Joseph, because of the situation which occurs with the 10 tribes which didn't survive and became assimilated. The Haftarah to this Torah portion is indeed echoes the characteristics and the prophecy which Jacob gives about the Judah. The rabbis chose 1 Kings chapter 2 as a connection. Here is the same situation with David, who becomes old of age, and he after all this ordeal, when Adoniah wants to become the king, and Bathsheba comes and pleads with David about his promise to put Solomon, finally David puts Solomon on a throne, and he talks to him, and he says here in 1 Kings chapter 2 verse 3, "Keep the charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his ordinances, and his testimonies, according to what is written in the law of Moses, that you may succeed in all that you do, wherever you turn, so that the Lord may carry out his promise, which he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons are carefully on their way to walk before me in truth with all their heart, with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. That was a continuation of Jacob's prophesying with regards to Judah. Eventually, when the people of Israel decided to have the king, Saul, Benjaminite, was selected first and failed his mission. David from the tribe of Judah was the first king of Israel. In fact, David is in some way a type of the Messiah. And he asks Solomon to carry out the mission by keeping the Torah, by keeping the mitzvah, by keeping God's ordinances. And he said, according to that, if you do this, the man shall not seize on the throne of Israel. Unfortunately, we see the prophecy came to the end because the man seized on the throne of Israel from the tribe of Judah. In some ways, it's a little dubious, but definitely today's Israel is not a monarchy in any sense, even though the majority definitely of those who live in Israel today call themselves Yehudim, which means there is a definite understanding among the Jewish people today that there is no one here today from the tribe of Judah, from the tribe of Dan, or from the tribe of Asher. Definitely the exception is made to the people by the last name Kohen, which is from the tribe of Levi. That's the exception, but the definite majority is from the tribe of the tribe of Judah. Can Prime Minister or President of Israel be called the man upon the throne of Israel? That's very doubtful. This is why it is worth looking at this text not in the human terms, but in divine terms, in the terms of the Messiah, the terms of that famous Shiloh, who comes and rules over Israel, who is the Lion of the tribe of Judah, as it is called in the book of Revelation chapter 5, when John is looking for someone who can break the 7 seals of the scroll. The scroll under the 7 seals, often used to seal the record of the property and debts. Only the one who had enough power to redeem someone who is bankrupt and in slavery had the authority to open up those seals, to look up what this person actually owed and what was his belonging. Today, only Messiah from the tribe of Judah has real power to redeem his people from the debt of and from the power of sin.